My name is Mary Catherine, and I became a mother and a fugitive on the same night. The labor pains had started at dawn on that sweltering August day in 1859. Deep in the Louisiana Bayou country, where Master Beauregard's sugar plantation stretched between the cypress trees and the muddy waters. By midnight, I held my daughter in my arms, a perfect tiny thing with skin the color of café au lait, and eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the world. She was 3 days old when I She was 3 days old when I made the decision that would change both our lives, forever. I had always known this moment would come. From the time I first felt her moving inside me, I had been planning our escape. Not because I didn't love the other souls who shared the quarters with me. Lord knows I loved them like family. But because I couldn't bear the thought of my baby girl growing up in chains, her spirit broken by the same system that had nearly destroyed mine. My own mother had birthed 8 children on this plantation. I was the only one still alive, the only one who hadn't been sold away or worked to death in the cane fields. Mama died when I was 15, worn down by grief and back-breaking labor, whispering with her last breath that I should find a way to be free. I had carried that whisper in my heart for 7 years, and now, holding my daughter, I knew the time had come to honor it. The plantation was quiet that night. It's the way it got after a hard day's work when even the crickets seemed tired. Master Beauregard was in New Orleans on business, and his son Charles was drunk as usual, passed out in the big house with a bottle of whiskey for company. The overseer, Jake Morrison, was somewhere out in the fields checking the night workers. His whip and his meanness keeping the cane cutters working even under the stars. It was as good a chance as I would ever get. I had been planning this escape for months, hiding away bits of food, studying the patterns of the guards, listening to whispered stories from other slaves about the treacherous bayou that surrounded our prison. Some said there were paths through the swamp that led to freedom, secret routes used by runaway slaves who had made it to New Orleans and beyond. Others said the bayou was a death trap, full of alligators and snakes and quicksand that would swallow you whole. But as I looked down at my sleeping daughter, I had named her Freedom in my heart. Though I called her Grace aloud to keep the overseers from getting suspicious, I knew I had to try. I would rather die fighting for her freedom than live watching her spirit get crushed under the weight of bondage. I wrapped Grace in the softest cloth I owned. It's a piece of cotton I had been saving for months. Everything else I needed was packed. In a small bundle, what little food I had managed to save, a knife I had stolen from the kitchen, and a small bottle of water that would have to last us until we found a stream. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The hardest part was leaving without saying goodbye to the people who had become my family. Old Sarah, who had helped birth Grace and taught me how to care for a newborn. Young Thomas, barely 16, who reminded me of the little brother I had lost. Aunt Bessie, who had practically raised me after Mama died and who would worry herself sick when she found my bed empty in the morning. But I couldn't risk telling anyone. Not because I didn't trust them, but because if we were caught, I didn't want them to face Master Beauregard's rage for helping us. The punishments for aiding escaped slaves were severe, and these people had suffered enough. I slipped out of the quarters just after midnight, when the moon was hidden behind clouds and the world was as dark as it ever got. Grace was sleeping peacefully against my chest, her tiny body warm and trusting. She didn't know that her mother was about to carry her into the most dangerous place in Louisiana, guided by nothing but desperate love and the faint hope that freedom lay somewhere beyond the cypress trees. The edge of the swamp was only a quarter-mile from the slave quarters, but it felt like walking to the edge of the world. Every step took us further from everything familiar and deeper into a wilderness that had swallowed countless other runaways without a trace. The Spanish moss hung like ghostly curtains from the ancient trees, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and standing water. I had studied this place during my brief moments of freedom. When I was sent to gather firewood or medicinal plants near the swamp's edge, I knew there was a path of sorts, really just a series of fallen logs and patches of solid ground that led deeper into the bayou. Runaway slaves had used it before, though none that I knew of had ever made it all the way to freedom. But standing at the threshold between captivity and the unknown, with my daughter's life depending on my courage, I stepped onto that first rotting log and entered the swamp. The water was knee-deep and black as coffee, warm as blood from the day's heat. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness, the splash of something large moving through the water, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the hollow call of night birds that sounded almost human. Every noise made my heart race, but I forced myself to keep moving, following what I hoped was a path by feeling with my feet for solid ground. Grace stayed asleep for the first hour, lulled by the gentle rocking motion as I carried her through the treacherous terrain. But as we went deeper into the swamp, the mosquitoes found us. They swarmed around my face and arms, biting through my thin dress, drawn by our warm blood and probably by the milk that leaked from my breasts. Grace woke with a cry of distress, and I had to stop on a patch of slightly higher ground to try to calm her. "Hush, baby girl," I whispered, rocking her gently while swatting away the insects that were making our lives miserable. "We got to be quiet now. We got to be brave." But Grace was hungry and uncomfortable, and my whispered reassurances weren't enough to settle her. Her cries grew louder, echoing through the swamp like a dinner bell for every predator within miles. I knew I had to keep moving, but I also knew that her cries would bring searchers. If we were still close enough to the plantation for them to hear, that's when I made my first real mistake of the night. In my desperation to quiet Grace and keep us moving, I stepped off what I thought was the path and into water that was deeper than I expected. Much deeper. The bottom dropped away beneath my feet, and suddenly I was struggling to keep both our heads above water, fighting against the weight of my waterlogged dress and the slippery mud that seemed determined to pull us down. Grace was screaming now, terrified by the sudden immersion in the warm, dark water. And I was fighting panic as I realized I had lost all sense of direction in the darkness. The solid ground I had been standing on was somewhere behind me. But which way? In the blackness of the bayou night, with my daughter crying and my own breath coming in ragged gasps, I couldn't tell north from south, much less find my way back to safety. That's when I heard it, the sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. The deep, rumbling bellow of an alligator, somewhere close in the darkness. Then another, answering the first. The predators had heard Grace's cries, and they were coming to investigate. I held my daughter tighter against my chest, and tried to move toward what I hoped was shore. But my feet couldn't find bottom, and my movements were clumsy with exhaustion and fear. Grace's cries were getting weaker, more desperate. And I realized with growing horror that we might not survive this first night of our bid for freedom. The water around us seemed to come alive with ripples and movement. Something large brushed against my leg, and I bit back a scream that would have brought every dangerous creature in the swamp straight to us. I could hear them now, the splash of heavy bodies moving through the water, the sound of something large breathing just a few yards away. We were trapped in the middle of the bayou, with no path back to slavery and no way forward to freedom. My beautiful daughter, barely 3 days in this world, was about to die because of my desperate attempt to save her from a life of bondage. That's when I heard the voice cutting through the darkness like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Don't move," it said, calm and authoritative despite the danger surrounding us. "Don't make a sound. I'm coming to get you." I couldn't see who was speaking. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere in the thick darkness. But there was something in those words, some quality of command and competence that made me believe this person might actually be able to help us. "Hold on," the voice said again. "Closer now. Both of you, just hold on. You're going to be all right." And in that moment, standing neck deep in alligator-infested water with my newborn daughter in my arms, I chose to believe him. The man who emerged from the darkness looked like something out of a fever dream. Tall and lean with long gray hair and a beard that hung to his chest, he moved through the black water with the confidence of someone who belonged there. His clothes were rough and patched, stained with mud and moss, and his eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of terrible things seen and done. But his hands were gentle as he reached for my daughter, and his voice was steady as he gave me instructions that probably saved both our lives. "Give me the baby," he said quietly. "I need both your hands free to get you out of this water." Every instinct screamed against letting a stranger take my child, especially here in the middle of nowhere with alligators circling us like sharks. But Grace was growing weaker in my arms, her cries fading to barely audible whimpers, and I could feel my own strength failing. This man, whoever he was, represented our only chance. I carefully transferred Grace to his waiting arms, watching as he tucked her securely against his chest with movements that suggested experience with infants. She settled immediately, as if she recognized safety even in this unlikely source. "What's your name, girl?" he asked as he began guiding me toward what I hoped was solid ground. "Mary Catherine?" I gasped, struggling to keep my footing on the slippery bottom. "And this is Grace." "I'm Ezekiel Morrison," he said. "Most folks call me Zeke, and you two have wandered into the most dangerous part of the bayou at the worst possible time." Ezekiel Morrison. The name seemed familiar, like something heard in whispered conversations among the field hands, but I couldn't place it. All I knew was that he was moving us steadily toward shore, navigating the treacherous water with ease that came from years of experience. "Easy now," he said as I stumbled on a submerged log. "There's cypress roots all through here. Step where I step, and keep your movements slow and quiet. We don't want to attract any more attention than we already have." It took 20 minutes to reach solid ground, 20 minutes that felt like hours, with Grace silent in the stranger's arms and the sounds of large predators following our progress through the water. But finally, my feet touched blessed solid. Earth and Zeke helped me climb onto a small island covered with Spanish moss and surrounded by ancient cypress trees. "Sit," he commanded, settling beside me and carefully returning Grace to my arms. "Both of you need to rest before we go any further." Grace immediately began rooting for milk, and I realized she must be desperately hungry after our ordeal in the water. I looked uncertainly at Zeke, uncomfortable with the idea of nursing my daughter in front of a strange man, but he had already turned away to give me privacy. "Go ahead and feed her," he said, his back to us as he scanned the darkness around our tiny refuge. "She needs the nourishment, and we need her quiet. We've got a long way to go before dawn." As Grace latched on and began nursing hungrily, I studied our unlikely rescuer in the faint starlight. He was older than I had first thought, probably in his mid-40s, with skin weathered by years of sun and wind. His clothes were practical, but well-made, and I noticed that he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "How did you find us?" I asked quietly. "Heard the baby crying? Sound carries far in the swamp at night." He glanced back at me, and I saw something like sympathy in his eyes. "You're not the first runaway to get lost in these waters, but you might be the first to try it with a newborn." "I had to try," I said defensively. "I couldn't let her grow up in chains." "I understand," Zeke said simply. "But understanding doesn't make it any less dangerous. This swamp has killed plenty of folks with more experience than you. Then why are you helping us?" The question hung in the air between us for a long moment. When Zeke finally answered, his voice carried a weight of old pain and regret. "'Cause I owe a debt," he said. "A debt so large I'll never be able to pay it off. But that doesn't stop me from trying." Before I could ask what he meant, Grace finished nursing and fell asleep again, her tiny body relaxed and trusting in my arms. Zeke turned back to us, his expression serious. "We need to move," he said. "Dawn's still 4 hours away, but there'll be search parties out soon. Your master won't take kindly to losing valuable property." The way he said valuable property made my skin crawl, but I recognized The truth in his words. Master Beauregard had paid good money for me, and he wouldn't let me disappear without a fight. By morning, there would be dogs and men with guns combing every inch of the plantation and the surrounding area. "Where are we going?" I asked as I struggled to my feet, my legs still shaky from our ordeal in the water. "Deeper into the swamp," Zeke said. "There's a place about 10 miles from here where runaway slaves sometimes hide. It's not much, but it's safe from search parties and their dogs." 10 miles through treacherous swamp terrain, carrying a newborn baby hunted by men with guns and tracking dogs. It seemed impossible, but the alternative was returning to slavery and probably facing punishment severe enough to cost Grace and me our lives. "Can we make it?" I asked. Zeke looked at me appraisingly, taking in my exhausted state and the precious burden in my arms. "That depends on how much you want your freedom," he said. "The path I know is dangerous, but it's passable if you're careful and quiet. The question is whether you're strong enough to do what needs to be done." I thought about my mother's dying words, about the 8 siblings I would never see again, about the life of backbreaking labor that awaited Grace if we were caught. I thought about the feel of the whip on my back, the sound of chains rattling. In the quarters, the hollow look in the eyes of slaves who had given up hope. "I'm strong enough," I said. "Then follow my lead," Zeke said, shouldering a pack I hadn't noticed before. "Step exactly where I step, do exactly what I do, and for God's sake, keep that baby quiet." One cry at the wrong moment could get us all killed. We set off into the deeper swamp, Zeke leading the way with sure, silent steps. He moved like a ghost through the Spanish moss and cypress roots, finding paths where I saw only impenetrable wilderness. I followed as closely as I dared, Grace sleeping peacefully against my chest, trusting that this strange man really could guide us to safety. But as we moved deeper into the bayou, I began to wonder who Ezekiel Morrison really was, and why a white man was risking his life to help escaped slaves navigate one of the most dangerous places in Louisiana. The name Morrison was familiar for some reason, connected to stories that made people's faces go hard and their voices drop to whispers. It wasn't until we had been walking for over an hour that I remembered where I had heard that name before. Morrison, the slave ship captain who had transported more human cargo from Africa to America than any other man of his generation. Morrison the butcher, they called him in the quarters, the man whose ships were floating tombs that deposited their broken survivors on auction blocks throughout the South. But that Morrison was supposed to be dead, killed in a storm off the coast of Georgia 5 years ago. And even if he were alive, why would such a man be helping slaves escape through the Louisiana bayou? I studied the man ahead of me with new eyes, looking for signs that would confirm or deny my growing suspicion. The bearing of command was there, the confidence of someone accustomed to navigating by the stars. The practiced way he moved through dangerous territory, always alert for threats from multiple directions. The haunted look in his eyes that spoke of things too terrible to forget. "Mr. Morrison," I said quietly during one of our brief rest stops, "what kind of debt are you trying to pay off?" He looked at me sharply, and I saw recognition in his eyes, the knowledge that I had figured out who he was, or at least who he had been. "The kind that cost thousands of people their lives," he said simply. "The kind that built fortunes on human suffering. The kind that no amount of good deeds can ever balance." So it was true. Our guide through the swamp was Ezekiel Morrison, the most notorious slave ship captain in the history of the trade, the man whose name was whispered in the quarters as a warning, whose ships had carried my own grandparents from their homeland to a life of bondage in Louisiana. "Why should I trust you?" I asked, holding Grace tighter against my chest. "Because Zeke said, his voice heavy with old pain, saving your life and your daughter's life is the only chance I have at redemption. Because every slave who reaches freedom with my help is one small step toward balancing the scales of justice. And because right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and a death sentence in this swamp." He was right, and we both knew it. Whatever his past crimes, Ezekiel Morrison was our only hope of survival. And perhaps, I thought as I looked into his haunted eyes, Helping us escape was as important to his soul as reaching freedom was to ours. "Follow my lead," he said again, rising to continue our dangerous journey through the bayou. And I did, carrying my daughter toward an uncertain freedom, guided by a man seeking redemption for unforgivable sins. By the time we reached what Zeke called the safe camp, dawn was painting the eastern sky the color of old blood, and I was stumbling with exhaustion. Grace had woken twice during our trek, forcing us to stop while I nursed her and tried to keep her quiet. Each delay made Zeke more nervous, his eyes constantly scanning the path behind us for signs of pursuit. The camp was nothing more than a small island of dry ground surrounded by water and protected by a thick wall of cypress trees and Spanish moss, but it had obviously been used by other runaways. There were the remains of old fires, crude shelters made from branches and moss, and most importantly, a freshwater spring that bubbled up from somewhere deep underground. "This'll do for now," Zeke said, helping me settle on a relatively dry patch of ground. "We can rest here until nightfall, then continue north toward the river." "What river?" I asked, accepting the cup of fresh water he offered from the spring. "Mississippi. There are people there who help runaways get passage north to free territory. It's not an easy journey, but it's possible if you're determined enough." I drank deeply, feeling the clean water wash away some of the exhaustion and fear that had been building all night. Grace stirred in my arms but didn't wake. Her tiny fist curled against my chest in perfect trust. "Mr. Morrison," I said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Call me Zeke," he said, settling against a fallen log with his rifle across his knees. "And you can ask whatever you want. I figure you've got a right to know who you're trusting with your life. How many people did you transport?" The question came out more bluntly than I intended, but I needed to know. "In your ships, I mean. How many people like me did you steal from their homes?" Zeke was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Over 20,000, he said. "In 15 years of running slave ships, I transported more than 20,000 human beings from Africa to America. Men, women, children, whole families torn apart and sold to the highest bidder. The number hit me like a physical blow. 20,000 people. 20,000 families destroyed. 20,000 lives stolen. 20,000 futures erased. By the man who is now risking his life to save Grace and me." "Why?" I asked. "Why did you do it?" "Because I was young and greedy, and I told myself they weren't really people," Zeke said, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cypress trees. "Because the money was good and the work was legal and everyone I knew said it was just business. Because I was a coward who chose profit over conscience." "What changed?" Zeke looked down at his hands, weathered and scarred from years of hard work. "A storm," he said. "A hurricane off the coast of Georgia in 1854. My ship went down with 350 people chained in the hold. I was one of only 12 survivors." I waited, sensing there was more to the story. I spent 6 days floating on debris, watching the bodies of my victims wash past me in the waves. Men, women, children, all dead because of my greed. One of them was a woman about your age, clutching a baby that couldn't have been more than a few months old. Both of them drowned because I had chained them in a ship's hold, like cargo, instead of treating them like human beings. Grace stirred in my arms, and I found myself holding her tighter as I imagined that terrible scene. "When I was finally rescued," Zeke continued, "I was a broken man. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't look at myself in a mirror without seeing the faces of everyone I had killed. I tried drinking, tried running away to places where nobody knew my name, tried everything I could think of to escape the guilt." "What brought you here?" "A preacher in New Orleans," Zeke said. "A man who told me that guilt without action was just self-pity, but guilt that led to service might eventually lead to forgiveness. He said if I really wanted to make amends, I needed to stop running from my crimes and start fighting against them, so you came to the swamp." "I've been here 5 years now," Zeke confirmed. "Living like a hermit, helping runaways when I can, trying to save as many lives as I can before I die. It's not enough. It could never be enough, but it's something. I studied this man who had been both devil and savior, trying to reconcile. The monster who had transported 20,000 people into slavery with the person who had risked his life to save Grace and me. It was almost impossible to believe they were the same person. "How many have you helped?" I asked. "Maybe 300 people over the years? Families, individuals, children separated from their parents. I guide them through the swamp, connect. Then with the Underground Railroad, help them find passage to free states." He looked at me directly. "But every person I save is still just a drop in the ocean compared to the damage I did." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "You could have helped us without revealing who you are, 'cause you deserve to know." Zeke said simply, "Because lying to you would make me the same coward I was before, and because ... He paused, looking down at Grace, sleeping peacefully in my arms. "Because that baby reminds me of the one I watched drown. And I need you to know that saving her means everything to me." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the awakening swamp. Birds called from the cypress trees, insects hummed in the warm air, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the splash of fish jumping in the deeper waters. It was beautiful in its own way, its hidden world that existed beyond the boundaries of civilization. But our peace was shattered by a sound that made my blood run cold. The distant baying of hounds. Zeke was on his feet instantly, his rifle ready and his face grim. "They're tracking us," he said. "Probably picked up our scent where we entered the water last night." "How far away?" I asked, struggling to my feet with Grace still sleeping in my arms. "Hard to tell in the swamp. Could be miles, could be much closer. Sound travels strange in this place." Zeke was already gathering his pack and checking his weapons. "Either way, we can't stay here." "But you said it was safe during the day." "Safe. From casual searchers, not from a determined pursuit with tracking dogs." Zeke's voice was tense with urgency. "Those hounds will follow our trail right to this spot if we don't move now." Grace woke as I lifted her to my shoulder, her tiny face scrunched with confusion at being disturbed. I tried to soothe her while Zeke led us deeper into the island's interior, looking for another way out that wouldn't leave an obvious trail. "There," he said, pointing to a fallen cypress that stretched across the water like a bridge. "We can cross there, and the water will break our scent trail." The log was slippery with moss and decay, barely wide enough for one person to cross safely. The water beneath it was dark and still, hiding whatever dangers lurked below the surface. But the sound of the hounds was getting closer, and we had no choice. "I'll go first," Zeke said. "Then you follow, but be careful. If you fall with the baby ... He didn't need to finish. We both knew what would happen if Grace and I ended up in the water again. It's time with exhausted bodies and desperate search parties closing in behind us. Zeke made it across easily. His years in the swamp, having given him the balance and confidence needed for such crossings. Then it was my turn, with Grace whimpering softly against my chest and my heart pounding so hard. I was sure it could be heard miles away. The log was more treacherous than it looked. The moss made every step slippery, and the wood itself was soft, with rot in places threatening to break under my weight. Halfway across, I felt the bark give way beneath my left foot, and for a terrifying moment, I thought we were going to fall. "Easy," Zeke called softly from the other side. "Don't look." "Dan, just keep moving toward my voice." I forced myself to take one careful step after another, Grace's weight throwing off my balance but also serving as a reminder of why I had to succeed. We were almost across when the hound's baying suddenly grew much louder, close enough that I could hear the splash of men moving through water behind us. "They've found our trail," Zeke said grimly as he helped me onto solid ground. "We've got maybe 20 minutes before they reach this spot. Can we outrun them?" "Not in your condition. Carrying a baby." Zeke's face was set in hard lines as he calculated our options. "But there's another way, something I've never tried before, but desperate times ... What are you thinking? There's a place about half a mile from here where the swamp connects to an underground river system. It's caves that run for miles beneath the bayou, coming out near the Mississippi. It's dangerous, easy to get lost, pockets of bad air that can kill you, but it would hide us completely from the search parties. Grace chose that moment to start crying, her voice echoing through the swamp like a beacon for our pursuers. I tried to calm her, but she was hungry and frightened, and nothing I did seemed to help. The sound of the hounds was getting closer. The caves, I said quickly. Show me the caves. Mary Catherine, you need to understand, once we go underground, there's no turning back. If we get lost down there, if the air goes bad, if the passages flood, ... we could die horribly, all three of us. And if we stay here, they'll catch us for sure. I looked into Zeke's haunted eyes and saw my own desperation reflected there. You said you wanted to save lives to balance the scales. Well, here's your chance. Save us, or let us all die trying. Zeke stared at me for a long moment, then nodded grimly. Follow my lead, he said, and pray that God has mercy on all of us. As we plunged deeper into the swamp toward the hidden caves with the sound of pursuit growing closer behind us, I realized that our journey into the darkness was about to become both literal and metaphorical. We were trusting our lives to a man seeking redemption for unforgivable sins, betting everything on the chance that love and determination might be stronger than the forces of hatred and greed that had shaped our world. Grace's cries echoed through the Spanish moss as we ran toward an uncertain salvation, guided by a former slave captain who carried the weight of 20,000 souls on his conscience. Behind us, a hound bayed for blood. Ahead of us lay only darkness and the hope of freedom. The entrance to the cave system was hidden behind a curtain of Spanish moss and cypress roots, so well concealed that I would have walked past it a dozen times without noticing. Zeke had to pull aside the natural camouflage to reveal an opening, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. The darkness beyond was absolute, carrying the smell of stagnant water and ancient stone. Once we go in there, Zeke said, lighting a small lantern he pulled from his pack, we're committed. The main passage runs about 8 miles underground before it opens up near the Mississippi. There are side tunnels, dead ends, places where the ceiling drops so low you have to crawl. We get separated or lost. He didn't need to finish. I could hear the search party clearly, now men's voices calling to each other. Splash of boots in swamp water, the excited baying of hounds that had found a fresh scent trail. They would reach our hiding spot within minutes. How do you know about these caves? I asked as Grace whimpered against my chest. Found them by accident 3 years ago, when I was running from a different search party, Zeke admitted. Spent 2 days underground before I found my way out. Nearly died down there, but I learned the route. Been meaning to map it properly, but a shout from behind us cut off his explanation. The searchers had found the island where we'd rested, and it wouldn't take them long to pick up our trail leading to this spot. We go now, Zeke said firmly. Stay close to me. Watch your head, and whatever happens, don't let go of that baby. The passage was worse than I had imagined. The ceiling was so low in places that I had to bend nearly double. And the floor was a treacherous mixture of slippery stone and standing water that sucked at my feet like quicksand. Grace's cries echoed strangely in the confined space, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But after the first 100 yards, something remarkable happened. Grace suddenly went quiet, not from exhaustion or fear, but from what seemed like wonder. The lantern light danced off the cave walls, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that captivated her infant eyes. For the first time since we'd entered the swamp, she was calm and alert, studying this underground world with the curiosity of a child who didn't yet understand danger. She likes it down here, I whispered to Zeke, who was leading us through a particularly narrow section where the walls pressed close on both sides. Some children are born for adventure, he replied quietly. Maybe she knows this is the path to freedom. We had been underground for what felt like hours when we encountered our first serious obstacle. The passage ahead was flooded, dark water stretching into the lantern light as far as I could see. The ceiling dropped down to within inches of the water's surface, making it impossible to tell how deep the flood was or how far it extended. "Is there another way?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "Not that I know of," Zeke said grimly. "Last time I came through here, this section was dry. There must have been heavy rains recently, or maybe something's blocking the drainage further down." Grace had started fussing again, perhaps sensing our tension or simply needing to nurse. The thought of trying to breastfeed my daughter while wading through an underground flood made my stomach turn, but we didn't have much choice. "How deep do you think it is?" I asked. Zeke waded a few steps into the dark water, testing the depth with his feet. "Chest deep, maybe deeper in the middle. The current's not too strong," but he turned back to me, his face grave in the lantern light. "Mary Catherine, I have to be honest with you. This is more dangerous than anything we've faced so far. If the water gets deeper, if the ceiling drops any lower, if you lose your footing, we drown." I finished for him. "Yes, we drown." I looked down at Grace, who was staring up at me with perfect trust, completely unaware that her mother was about to make a decision that could cost both their lives. Behind us, somewhere in the darkness we'd left behind, men with guns and dogs were hunting us like animals. Ahead of us lay an underground river that might lead to freedom or death. "What would you do?" I asked Zeke if it was your child. Questions seemed to hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, his composure cracked, and I saw the grief and guilt that he carried like stones in his heart. "I had a child once," he said quietly, "a daughter. She died of fever when she was 2 years old while I was at sea running cargo from Africa. I never got to say goodbye, never got to hold her when she was scared, never got to protect her when she needed me most." He looked at Grace with an expression that mixed love and pain in equal measure. "If it was my child," he said finally, "I'd walk through hell itself to give her a chance at freedom. I'd risk everything because living as a slave is a kind of death anyway. And at least this way, she'd have a fighting chance." I nodded, understanding that Zeke wasn't just talking about Grace and me. He was talking about the daughter he'd lost, the thousands of children he'd helped condemn to slavery, and the chance for redemption that our survival represented. "Then we go forward," I said, "all of us together." The water was shockingly cold after the warm air of the cave passage. Within steps, it was up to my waist, and I could feel the current tugging at my dress, trying to pull me off balance. Grace gasped at the sudden change in temperature, but didn't cry. It was as if she understood that silence was necessary for survival. Zeke led the way, testing each step carefully and holding the lantern high to keep it dry. The ceiling pressed down so close to the water that we had to duck our heads, and in some places, there were only inches of breathing space above the surface. "Don't fight the current," Zeke advised as we made slow progress through the flooded passage. "Let it help carry you, but keep your feet moving to maintain balance." Halfway through the flood, Grace decided she was hungry. She began rooting against my chest, making small sounds of distress that echoed loudly in the confined space. I tried to soothe her with whispered words and gentle rocking, but she was insistent. "She needs to nurse," I said to Zeke. "Can you manage it while we keep moving?" he asked. "We're almost through this section." I adjusted my grip on Grace and carefully lifted my dress enough to allow her to latch on. It was awkward and uncomfortable, trying to breastfeed while wading through chest-deep water in a cave. But Grace settled immediately once she began nursing. The peaceful sound of her contented swallowing was the sweetest music I'd ever heard. "You're a good mother," Zeke said quietly as we continued through the water. "She's lucky to have someone willing to fight so hard for her freedom." "I'm fighting for both of us," I replied. "I want her to grow up knowing that her mother was brave enough to choose hope over safety." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the water began to get shallower and the ceiling lifted. We emerged from the flood section, soaked and exhausted, but alive, and Grace had finished nursing and fallen asleep again, apparently unfazed by our underground adventure. "The worst is behind us now," Zeke said as we continued through a higher, drier passage. "Another mile or so, and we'll reach the exit near the river." But our relief was short-lived. So we rounded a bend in the passage, Zeke's lantern illuminated, something that made us both freeze in terror. The passage ahead was completely blocked by a recent cave-in, tons of rock and debris that would take days to clear, even with proper tools. "No," Zeke breathed, his face pale in the lantern light. "This wasn't here before." The flooding must have weakened the ceiling, caused a collapse. We stood there staring at the wall of rubble, reality sinking in slowly. We couldn't go back. The flooded section was bad enough going forward, but trying to navigate it in reverse, while carrying Grace, would be suicide. And we couldn't go forward because there was literally nowhere to go. "Are there any side passages?" I asked desperately. "Any other way through?" Zeke raised the lantern, examining the cave walls around us. "There," he said, pointing to a narrow opening near the ceiling, barely visible in the shadows. "I never explored it before because it looks too small, but ... But it's our only chance." I finished. The opening was indeed small, perhaps 2 feet high and 3 feet wide, leading into darkness that seemed to swallow the lantern light. Getting to it would require climbing over loose rocks and debris, and once inside we'd have to crawl on our bellies with no guarantee that the passage led anywhere useful. "I'll go first," Zeke said. "Test whether it's passable. If I can get through and find another way, I'll come back for you." "No," I said firmly. "We stay together. This passage leads nowhere. If you get stuck or lost, Grace and I will die here anyway. We all go through together, or none of us do." Zeke looked like he wanted to argue, but he must have seen the determination. In my eyes, "All right," he said. "But I'll still go first. Make sure the passage is stable. You follow close behind." The climb to the opening was treacherous, especially while carrying Grace. The rocks were loose and sharp, cutting through my thin dress and scraping my knees and hands raw. But gradually, carefully, we made our way up to the narrow passage entrance. Zeke disappeared into the opening with the lantern, leaving Grace and me in darkness that was absolute and terrifying. I could hear him moving ahead of us, the sound of his body scraping against stone, his labored breathing echoing strangely in the confined space. "It's tight," his voice called back to us, "but it seems to open up after about 20 feet. Can you make it?" Looking at that narrow opening, trying to imagine crawling through it while protecting my 3-day-old daughter, I felt fear more intense than anything I'd experienced during our entire journey. But behind that fear was something stronger, the same determination that had driven me to step into the swamp in the first place. "Follow my lead," I whispered to Grace, echoing Zeke's words from what seemed like a lifetime ago. The passage was a nightmare of rough stone and cramped space. I had to crawl on my belly, using my elbows to pull myself forward while cradling Grace against my chest with one arm. Every few feet, sharp rocks caught at my dress or scraped against my back. The air was thin and stale, making each breath an effort. But Grace seemed almost to enjoy this underground adventure. She stayed awake and alert, her dark eyes reflecting the distant lantern light, her tiny hand reaching out occasionally to touch the stone walls around us. It was as if she understood that this dark passage was the birth canal that would deliver us both into freedom, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The passage began to widen. I could hear Zeke ahead of us, his voice carrying excitement for the first time since we'd entered the caves. "I can see light," he called back. "Natural light. We're almost out." The exit was a crack in the hillside overgrown with vines and ferns, so well hidden that it would be invisible from more than a few feet away. But beyond the vegetation, I could see genuine daylight. Not the flickering illumination of Zeke's lantern, but real sunlight filtered through real leaves. We emerged into a world transformed. Instead of the dark, humid bayou we'd left behind, we found ourselves on the bank of the mighty Mississippi River. The water stretched before us like a highway to freedom, its muddy surface reflecting the afternoon sun. On the far shore, barely visible in the distance, lay the free state of Mississippi, or at least as free as anywhere could be in 1859. There, Zeke said, pointing to a small dock about a quarter-mile upstream. That's where the underground railroad contacts make their pickups. If we can get there before nightfall, there should be someone who can help you get passage north. Grace had awakened and was looking around at this new world with wide eyes, as if she knew that something fundamental had changed. The air smelled different here, cleaner with the scent of flowing water instead of stagnant swamp. Even the quality of light seemed different, brighter, and more hopeful. What about you? I asked Zeke, as we made our way carefully along the riverbank. Will you come with us? He shook his head sadly. My place is back in the swamp, helping the next runaway who needs a guide through the darkness. This is as far as my journey goes. But surely you've earned some peace, I said. Surely you've done enough to balance the scales. 20,000 souls, Zeke said simply. I've helped maybe 300 reach freedom. The mathematics of redemption aren't in my favor. As we approached the dock, I could see a figure waiting there. An elderly black man with kind eyes and clothes that marked him as a free person. He looked up as we approached, his face lighting up with a smile that spoke of countless other runaways guided safely to this spot. Welcome to freedom, sister, he said to me, then looked at Grace with wonder. And welcome to the world, little one. You chose a brave mother to bring you into it. As I prepared to say goodbye to the man who had saved our lives, I realized that Zeke had given Grace and me something more precious than freedom. He had given us the knowledge that redemption was possible, that people could change, that even the worst sinner could choose to fight for justice instead of profit. Thank you, I said, holding Grace up so she could see the man who had guided us through the darkness. Someday, when she's old enough to understand, I'll tell her about the slave ship captain who became our angel in the swamp. Zeke's eyes filled with tears as he looked at Grace one last time. Tell her, he said, that every life saved is a light in the darkness. Tell her that freedom is worth any sacrifice, any risk, any price. As Zeke disappeared back into the vegetation that hid the cave entrance, Grace and I began the next phase of our journey to freedom. But we carried with us the knowledge that we had been guided by a man seeking redemption for unforgivable sins. A man who had chosen to spend his remaining years lighting the way for others walking the path from bondage to liberty. The Underground Railroad conductor helped us into a small boat that would carry us across the Mississippi toward true freedom. As we pulled away from the Louisiana shore, I held Grace up to see the land we were leaving behind. The place where she had been born, into slavery, but from which she was departing as a free child. Remember this, I whispered to her as the boat carried us toward our new life. Remember that when the world seems darkest, there are still people willing to light the way. Remember that redemption is possible for anyone willing to fight for it. And remember that your mother loved you enough to carry you through hell itself to give you the chance to choose your own destiny. Grace looked up at me with those wise, dark eyes, and I swear she smiled, not the reflexive expression of a newborn, but the genuine smile of a child who understood on some level that she was embarking on the greatest adventure of all, the adventure of living as a free human being behind us. The Louisiana Bayou held its secrets, including the story of a former slave ship captain who had found his salvation in guiding others to freedom. Ahead of us lay uncertainty, challenge, and the boundless possibility that comes with the right to choose one's own path through life. I had carried my newborn across the swamp at midnight, guided by a man who knew every path through the darkness, because he had once been the darkness himself. Okay, and in doing so, we had all found something we desperately needed. Grace and I had found freedom. Kay and Zeke had found the possibility of redemption. It was enough. It was everything.